I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. It was unknown how much longer peace could be maintained between the Mormon settlement of Nauvoo and the anti-Mormons in nearby Carthage and Warsaw, Illinois. Both sides felt their rights had been infringed. Both sides considered the other antithetical to the existence of their own side. Both of them wanted to get Governor Thomas Ford on their side, which would grant them license to do whatever they saw fit, at least in their eyes. Neither party imagined a de-escalation of the conflict without some kind of climactic resolution. For the Mormons, that might be warfare against yet another state. For the anti-Mormons, it might be warfare against the Mormons in yet another state. Both sides were ratcheting up the conflict, and only violent resolution of some kind seemed to be the pacification for all of these growing troubles. Conflict, however, spelled disaster for all involved parties, but that didn't stop them from glorifying in the destruction of their enemies. But war has some significant costs beyond human life. How does a state sustain militias of men who are normally blacksmiths and farmers? Those soldiers need to be fed, and the work that they'd be doing if they weren't engaged in warfare still needs to be done. The Mormons, on the other hand, had demonstrated in their past that if they're unable to sustain themselves during warfare with their own provisions, they'll just raid local non-Mormon settlements for supplies. So at the end of the day, this lawlessness gave the Mormons the upper hand in any armed conflict, and it made the non-Mormon settlements surrounding Nauvoo square in the crosshairs of becoming victims of collateral damage. We should never get this mixed up. The Mormons had only their own self-preservation in mind. They owed no loyalty to country or fellow American. The leadership, by extension, and the membership at large, had sworn oaths of fealty to Joseph Smith, and they would follow him straight to the gates of hell at the cost of their own lives if demanded. What complicated matters further is the non-Mormons and, anti-Mormons knew this to be the case, even if thousands of Mormons themselves didn't know that. More importantly, Governor Thomas Ford knew the Mormons would follow Joseph Smith to hell, and he knew that he was arriving to a fire surrounded with powder kegs when he got to Carthage, Illinois. Accordingly, the issue needed to be handled prudently and with as little excitement as possible to try and keep everything from blowing up. Near the end of last week's episode, we read the letter that Governor Ford sent to Joseph Smith about sending a messenger to Carthage who can tell Governor Ford the Mormon side of the story. Notably, the messenger was free to enjoy passage between the two rival cities of Carthage and Nauvoo in exchange for free passage of any messengers from Carthage who needed to enter Nauvoo on official business. Joe's conduct following Governor Ford's arrival reveals to me that he knew he was on the wrong side. He knew he was in the wrong, and he knew that he had made a series of mistakes. There's a tired old phrase, innocent people don't run. And obviously, whoever coined that phrase has never seen a video of, a police officer shooting an unarmed black man, but there is a nugget of truth there worth consideration. If Joe thought that he was innocent and that he had the law on his side, he never would have gone into hiding in the first place. Of all the times that he did. And we'll get to that eventually, but the point remains. Joe had a habit of running away from his problems, and once Governor Ford arrived on the scene, a reckoning with the law was nigh at hand, and Joe was well aware that he wasn't going to win a fair trial. It was becoming a repeat of the Missouri Mormon War. Armies were amassing all around the Mormon settlements. The leadership had committed crimes. This could only be resolved in one of two ways. The guilty are arrested and taken to court, or the Mormon settlement wages war on the state of Illinois. Those were the only options, and the future of Mormonism hinged on the result. Now that Governor Thomas Ford was in town, all these pressures became more urgent, and everything needed to be handled without delay. John Bernheisel and John Taylor being the second prophet of the Salt Lake City Church, set out for Carthage to have a meeting with Governor Ford with a folder of affidavits and their stories prepared. Whiteout Willard Richards was under consideration for making the trip as well, but being Joe's chief propaganda minister, quote, Dr. Richards tarried to prepare additional documents, end quote. Those additional documents that Whiteout Willard Richards prepared were more affidavits. While the Johns, Bernheisel, and Taylor had plenty of statements to exhibit to Governor Ford, events were still happening all around the Mormons, and Whiteout Willard had to continue collecting more information about those events. The Mormon leadership wanted to establish the precedent that a conspiracy was afoot to take Joe's life. There probably was, but they wanted plenty of documentation to show it. And the perpetrators of said conspiracy were the same folks who published the Nauvoo Expositor, as well as Joseph H. Jackson, a scoundrel of a dude that we've talked about these past few weeks quite a bit, who was kind of trying to play both sides of the conflict at the time. The affidavits that Whiteout Willard Richards collected center around a trip that Joe made to Carthage with his posse back on May 27th. Now, May 27th was between when the prospectus of the Expositor and the Expositor itself was published. The prospectus was on May 10th, and the Expositor itself was on June 7th. So this was a trip that Joe made with his posse to Carthage on May 27th. He made this trip to Carthage because, quote, thinking it best for me to meet my enemies before the circuit court and have the indictment against me investigated, end quote. So Joe and his posse of like 45 guys, they all descended on Carthage and stayed the night there at the only tavern in town that could accommodate a large, armed posse like this, Hamilton's Hotel. While they were at Hamilton's Hotel, Joe found out that 3 of the soon-to-be publishers of the Expositor were staying at the hotel as well, in addition to Joseph H. Jackson. This is where Joe made his speech, during this trip, that he has more to boast of than ever any man had, and that he's better than Jesus and all that stuff. All the while, Joseph H. Jackson was spotted by the posse on a grassy knoll, watching them ride past on the road while he was loading his pistols, getting ready for action. Pistol Packin' Porter Rockwell even got in a fight with Chauncey Higby, and the tavern owner kicked Porter out of the building. A bunch of the citizens of Carthage were, motivated by the Expositor printers, and they were all mustered and ready to jump Joe's posse because they, quote, were determined I should not get out of Carthage alive, etc. Jackson was seen to reload his pistols and was heard to swear he would have satisfaction of me and Hiram, end quote. In the end, it was learned that the judge who was supposed to hear the complaints of Joe and the conspirators who apparently wanted to kill Joe, he wasn't in town, and Joe's posse returned to Nauvoo unscathed, but also sufficiently terrified. If only Joe could have, looked in his seer stone to learn that the judge wasn't in town instead of having a very close scrape with a bunch of dudes who wanted to kill him. But that was all back on May 27th, that the enemies met at Hamilton's Hotel in Carthage. And it was the last time that Joe set foot in the city before the Carthage jail where he would be assassinated. It was a chaotic trip. The whole thing was. It was a total mess. So one of the men who was part of the posse was the Nauvoo City Marshal, John P. Green, who made an affidavit before Whiteout Willard Richards about what happened then. He made this affidavit on June 21st. Quote, on or about the 27th day of May, 1844, while at Hamilton's Tavern in Carthage, in company with Joseph Smith and others, Robert D. Foster, one of the publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor, called a deponent into a private room, and there and then said, for God's sake, don't suffer that man, Joseph Smith, to go out of doors, for if he steps outside of the door, his blood will be spilt. To which statement, deponent, John P. Green, replied he had no such fears, when said Foster confirmed said statements with considerable emotion, and said he knew that Smith could not go out of doors, but his blood would be spilt. Deponent asked Foster who would do it. Foster said he would not tell, but he knew the proud spirit of Joseph Jackson, that he would not be insulted, and that he would kill Joseph Smith if he had to die on the spot. And there were many others in Carthage who would assist to do the same thing. Joseph H. Jackson was in the house below at the time. This is in Hamilton's Hotel. A day or two previous to the above conversation, while at Carthage, aforesaid deponent heard Joseph H. Jackson say that Joseph Smith was the damnedest rascal in the world, and he would be damned if he did not take vengeance on him if he had to follow him to the Rocky Mountains. And said Jackson made many more such like threats against Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. Signed, John P. Green, end quote. And Robert D. Foster is quite the conspirator to be wanting to take Joe's life, isn't he? Warning your target that he's about to die before participating in a plan to kill him. That doesn't seem like a very prudent way of carrying out an assassination. But similarly, Joe made his own affidavit of his version of the story. Quote, Joseph Smith saith that while at Hamilton's tavern at Carthage, where the deponent had gone to transact business in the circuit court, Charles A. Foster took deponent into a private room and told deponent there was a conspiracy against the life of deponent, and that deponent had not better go out of door. If he did, his blood would be shed. Foster said he was deponent's friend and did not want to see bloodshed. End quote. So not only Robert D. Foster, but also his brother, Charles A. Foster, two people that Joe had named personally from the pulpit as being conspirators to kill him for over 3 months now. They told Joe that he needed to watch his back because Jackson's going to kill him if he steps out of the front door of the hotel. I mean, were these men actually the threat that Joe had made them out to be in multiple sermons, or were there actually greater threats and these men weren't actually as bad as Joe claimed? Or, were they possibly just honest people who were seeking reformation in the church and did so by publishing the Expositor? Now, these affidavits were made to point to Jackson as the primary aggressor in the plot to kill Joseph Smith. However, these events had transpired back in, late May 27th, before the Expositor was published and the press was destroyed, before the riots, before martial law was declared, before all of this most recent excitement that we've been talking about for like 2 months now. However, Joe took matters concerning Joseph Jackson into his own hands. On June 21st, now we're back to the present, no longer in May 27th, we're back on June 21st when these affidavits are being made. Joe received word that Jackson had been spotted just outside of Nauvoo and that he was vulnerable. If Joe could get Jackson arrested, that's a major threat with a ton of insider knowledge that would be locked down and under Joe's control. And accordingly, quote, about 11 a.m., a rumor was circulated at General Dunham's headquarters, that's General Jonathan Dunham of the Nauvoo Legion, that Joseph H. Jackson was seen at Davidson Hibbard's. He ordered out a posse to arrest Jackson, which went accordingly, but returned with no success. End quote. Now, this is fascinating for a few reasons. Joe's Danite, Jonathan Dunham, was unable to effect the arrest of Jackson, and no further details are provided as to why they weren't successful in arresting him. Maybe Jackson evaded them. Maybe they did catch up with him, but then they didn't arrest him for some reason. But the primary reason I find it so fascinating comes 2 pages later in the history of the church. The same day the posse rode out to Davidson Hibbard's to arrest Jackson, Jackson made 2 affidavits in front of Double Dubs Phelps in Nauvoo, which were calculated to help the Mormon cause. Now, these people were Jackson's enemies, right? He was caught up in a plot and the primary perpetrator of a plot to kill Joseph Smith, yet his 2 affidavits give credence to the growing anti-Mormon violence. Here they are, quote, Jackson saith that on Tuesday the 11th instant, he was in Nauvoo when Francis M. Higbee, that's a publisher of the Expositor, of course, while speaking of the destruction of the printing press, said he was very sorry, for the proprietors had set up that press for the destruction of the city, and that he meant to kill Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, and he saith no further, end quote. But Jackson did saith further, because this is Jackson's second affidavit taken the same day, quote, Jackson saith that on the 19th day of June instant, that's 2 days before this affidavit was given, at his residence near Pilot Grove in the afternoon, about 24 persons fired about 26 guns at him. Some of them were dual wielding or something? I don't know how that works. And that the balls whistled close by his head. Thus, this mob, of which John McKay was one, fired about 100 guns. How did 24 people fire 100 guns? But not all at your affiant. And that this mob was very noisy, cursing and swearing that they would kill every damned Mormon. And he says no further, end quote. So maybe the Danite, Jonathan Dunham, did actually catch up with Joseph H. Jackson, and they brokered a deal to get him to swear out these affidavits about the mob violence and how he narrowly escaped with his life as bullets whizzed by his head. This is the same Jackson who Joe and Hiram saw on the grassy knoll loading his pistols to try and bum rush the Mormon posse who was leaving Carthage back on May 27th. This is the same Jackson who attempted to work with the publishers of the Expositor And they told Joe that this same Jackson was trying to kill him. This is the same Jackson who joined the church under false pretenses to infiltrate the Mormon stronghold and gain Joe's trust and expose the corruption of this religious regime, just like Reckitt Bennett had done. These affidavits being given in front of Phelps just after Jonathan Dunham attempted to arrest Jackson, quote unquote, without success, that evidences to me that Jackson was still trying to play both sides of the conflict like he'd been doing the whole time. Or, because martial law was declared, maybe he was arrested. We just don't know. So he gave these affidavits in Nauvoo, where he was viewed as public enemy number one, or one of the many public enemies number one. It's incredibly fascinating, and whether or not these affidavits were given by him as some kind of deal that was brokered between him and the Danite, Jonathan Dunham, it's just one of those things we'll never know. It also should be noted that there's no evidence that a group of some 20-odd guys fired over 100 guns at Jackson and that they'd said they'd kill every damn Mormon. And I'm sure there were plenty of men saying that they would kill every damned Mormon, but if actually firing on Jackson, it seems like his typical storytelling. A tall tale. Given the circumstances and Jackson's relationship with the Mormon leadership that led to these affidavits, I'm convinced that much of the information was just fabricated. Immediately following Jackson's affidavits, the history of the church also claims that a private blank, quote, gave information that he was passing an hour since, about 2 miles out of the city, to his home. He was fired upon by some unknown person, end quote. And in response to this, Joe dispatched General Stephen Markham, that's who we call Biggie Bang Steve, quote, ordered out a detachment to proceed to the designated place, scour that part of the country, and see that all was right, end quote. So were there just groups of, quote unquote, anti-Mormons camped outside of the city and just shooting at anybody that they saw walking towards Nauvoo? Is that really what was going on here? Now, I get it. Like, people riled up into a kind of frenzy. Like, I understand that they aren't acting rationally, but just shooting at anybody who walks by, that seems absolutely insane to me and very hard to believe is what I'm really saying here. And why I find that really hard to believe is that anti-Mormons just taking pot shots at Mormons indiscriminately like this, that would be answered with equal aggression by the Mormons. And there isn't really evidence that the Mormons fired a single shot during this time, or else it would be plastered all over the Warsaw Signal and the Quincy Whig and all the other anti-Mormon papers. And that would have incited more violence, which didn't end up happening. But regardless of these allegations, the Warsaw Signal printed a resolution, which was passed in the Iowa Territory, voicing unequivocal support for the non-Mormon settlements. Here's the resolution, quote, whereas it is abundantly evident to us that Joe Smith is the boldest blasphemer, the greatest debauchee, the most successful swindler, and consummate outlaw that ever disgraced human form. Therefore be it resolved that we intend by all lawful means to protect ourselves and families from Joe Smith and his lawless banditti. Resolved that we will not shelter him or any of his adherents, nor allow them to stop among us if law can prevent it. Resolved that we do deeply sympathize with the citizens of Hancock County, Illinois, in their difficulties with Joe, and that we will give them any assistance they may require or the law allows to aid in the execution of the laws of the land. Resolved that the proceedings of this meeting be forwarded to the Warsaw Signal for publication, end quote. So now Iowa Territory was on board with the anti-Mormons. And in this same issue of the Warsaw Signal, intelligence of a very concerning nature was reported, which involved the arrival of Governor Ford, which was expected the day after this extra was published. It says, quote, an order has been granted by His Excellency, it's Governor Thomas Ford, to try Joe Smith by court-martial for unofficerly conduct, end quote. This was huge. And this was printed the day before Thomas Ford arrived in Carthage, that they received intel that he wanted to hold a court-martial for Joseph Smith. Now, why that's huge is treason committed by an officer of a state militia would carry the death penalty from a court-martial immediately, right? Now, if we remember all the way back to the Missouri Mormon War, once General Lucas, and that's 1838, that's 6 years prior in our timeline. That's in the double-digit episodes, right? Episodes like 38 through 52 or something. Once General Lucas was able to get the Mormon leadership to surrender outside of Far West, General Lucas held a court-martial for Joseph Smith and his 5 co-conspirators, and they came to the verdict that Joe, Rigdon, and Hiram and the others were guilty of treason, the result of which was that General Lucas ordered Major General Alexander Donovan to execute them by firing squad the following morning in the city square of Far West in front of 3,000 Mormons. Now, General Donovan was a friend of the Mormons, and he refused the order from his commanding officer, telling General Lucas that he would carry the trial to Richmond and he would have Lucas prosecuted for murder. But the technicality which rendered Lucas's court-martial invalid was that Joe's militia wasn't a state-sanctioned militia, it was a rebel militia. And therefore, he had a court of inquiry instead of this court-martial actually being valid. Now, the circumstances in Nauvoo were different because the Nauvoo Legion was a recognized state militia under the command of a city mayor. Any treasonous action committed by Joe and his boys this time around would actually stick and likely would be adjudicated in a court-martial, resulting in a verdict of guilty for treason, and Joseph Smith would be executed on the spot by firing squad. Now, the Warsaw Signal printing their new intelligence that Governor Ford intended to hold a court-martial for Joseph Smith, that was important news because if it could be determined that Joe had actually committed treason with his militia, Governor Ford would rightfully execute the prophet in a military capacity and thereby forego all of the troubles of trying everything in a civil criminal court. That's where this case belonged, and receiving the intel that Governor Ford intended to try it in a court-martial, that was dangerous news for Joe and the Mormons. In this same issue of June 19th of the Warsaw Signal Extra, we find more evidence that was troubling to the nearby citizens. And it was known in the city of Nauvoo that Joe had declared martial law on June 18th, but that information needed a day to travel to Carthage and to Warsaw. So in a postscript of the 19th issue of the Signal, we find this little gem, which reveals a bit of what it was like traveling between the cities of Nauvoo and Carthage. Quote, "We stopped the press for the purpose of presenting our readers with additional proof of the declaration of martial law in Nauvoo. 2 gentlemen left this place on the 18th instant for that city. They arrived during a severe shower of rain and were not molested until they had reached the mansion house." That's Joseph Smith Nauvoo mansion, right? "They were then told that they could not leave the city without a pass!" Exclamation point. Yeah, Thomas Sharp, his writing is kind of fun, right? The same was reiterated by Joe Smith with the additional remark that all who were there should be made to remain and fight for him. He was going to conscript these random travelers into the Nauvoo Legion. Am I the only person who thinks that's crazy? It continues. "Sentries were stationed throughout the city, and as far as they could judge, the most rigid adherence to military law was observed. One of the gentlemen was so fortunate to have an acquaintance in the city, through whose urgent solicitation, backed by assurances of good intentions, they were enabled to procure a pass. While in the city, they were closely questioned as to their residence, business, and destination by persons who appeared to act by authority. They also report that several persons in the city were under arrest. One family of immigrants bound for Iowa were detained, being unable to procure a pass. The following affidavit will corroborate the foregoing." Quote, this is now quoting an affidavit that was printed in the Warsaw Signal about, from one of the travelers about what had happened there. "James Cameron, being duly sworn, deposeth and saith, that on the 19th day of June instant, he went to Nauvoo on business, and on his return from said city near the corporation line of said city, he was stopped by a guard at said place, and told that he could not pass without orders from their headquarters at the Masonic House." Now, this is pretty interesting too, because they allowed these people to enter the city, but then they couldn't leave the city. They needed a pass not to enter the city, but they needed a pass to leave the city, which I'm sure that there's some tactical reason for doing that, but I'm struggling to try and kind of piece it together and figure out why it was done that way. Anyway, that thereupon he returned into the city and demanded of the authorities permission to leave said city. And upon his telling them he was a citizen of McDonough County, that he came there on business and was intending to return, they told him that he should have gone, and that afterwards a suspicion arising that he was a Carthaginian and a spy, they refused to give him permission to leave without his first taking an oath, in substance as follows: that he was not a spy, but had come on business, as stated, that he was not a Carthaginian, nor had any connection with them, that he had never been hostile to the Mormons, nor was now hostile to them. So that he needed to swear that oath. I'm not a spy, I'm not a Carthaginian, I'm only here on business, and I've never been hostile to the Mormons. He had to swear that oath before he could leave the city. His affidavit continues: that he would return home directly by way of La Harpe and by no means go to Carthage, that he would not inform the citizens of Carthage nor any other persons during life of what had occurred to him in Nauvoo, nor any information respecting their strength and movements in Nauvoo, that he might either take the oath, the substance of which is now just given, and return home, or if he refused to take said oath, he must remain there as a prisoner with them, to abide such decisions as they should come to respecting him. That whilst there amongst them, he heard it said in the crowd surrounding him that the Carthaginians and Mobocrats ought to be put to death, and that hell was too good for them. So not only does he have to swear the oath that he's not a spy, he's not a Carthaginian, he's never been hostile to the Mormons, and that he's there on business, he has to go home by way of La Harpe instead of going through Carthage, that he will never go through Carthage, and that during his life he will never tell anybody what happened in Nauvoo and how big the army is there. Really quite remarkable, the last little bit of it. That they took means of discovery whether or not he was a citizen of Carthage, as he supposed, to carry into effect their threat upon him as a citizen of said place. That to get away from said city of Nauvoo and avoid the danger he felt himself to be in whilst there, he took the above oath, and thereupon they gave him a strip of paper, which they told him was a pass, which was as follows. And then it prints the pass that they granted him. He said, I was afraid for my life, so I took the above oath so I could get a pass and I could get out of the city. And the pass says, this certifies that James Cameron can pass to his home in McDonough County in safety. Signed, Jonathan Dunham, the Danite Jonathan Dunham, Major General of the Nauvoo Legion. Fascinating, isn't it? That was martial law. You can infringe on the rights that are granted via the Constitution to citizens if you're in martial law. You can unlawfully detain them. You can seize them. You can throw them into jail. You can prevent their freedom of movement. You can instate a curfew. All of these powers were very clearly being exercised in the city of Nauvoo. And what's really, really interesting here, and is notable, and it really needs to be mentioned in this Warsaw Signal Extra, talking about this James Cameron guy and him being detained in Nauvoo, he gave his affidavit to Robert D. Foster, Justice of the Peace. Robert D. Foster, one of the publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor. Robert D. Foster was one of the elected officials, one of the elected justices of the peace of Hancock County. So he was still exercising his authority, even though he was now working out of Carthage instead of working out of Nauvoo. So James Cameron swore that affidavit to Robert D. Foster, who was, an insider of deep Mormon leadership circles prior to being excommunicated, forming his own church as an advisor to William Law, who was the president of that church, and publishing the Nauvoo Expositor. How the turns have tabled. Now, it's hard with all this too, because we don't have arrest records from Nauvoo, or if we do have them, I can't find them in digital format anywhere. So when it comes to arresting people and then holding them in the city jail for not having a pass during this martial law, we only have antagonistic reports from outlets like the Warsaw Signal like this to go with. However, it is a crucial window into the measures put in place to keep Nauvoo under the iron fist of the prophet, to keep it from spiraling out of the control of the Mormon leadership. And notably as well, Joe knew that things were quickly getting out of hand. He knew that he was going to be caught up in court for a while once Governor Ford was able to exercise proper legal authority, right? So he began to make decisions based on this realization, which came in the form of preserving the Mormon movement during his coming absence. And accordingly, Joe got together with his brother, Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith, and told him, stuff's getting a little too real. Quote, I advised my brother Hiram to take his family on the next steamboat and go to Cincinnati. Hiram replied, Joseph, I can't leave you. Whereupon I said to the company present, I wish I could get Hiram out of the way so that he may live to avenge my blood, and I will stay with you and see it out. End quote. Now, while that little bit, that was recorded after the deaths of both of these guys by George A. Smith, who didn't personally witness the conversation, and it contains dramatic elements, it's written obviously with hindsight, it is fascinating that Joe wanted to send Hiram to Cincinnati. Why Cincinnati? That's where Bloody Brigham Young had just arrived on his mission electioneering for Joe just 2 days prior. He was headed out to Boston, but he had only gotten to Cincinnati. So if Joe was locked up in the gridlock of the Illinois state legal system for months, like he was expecting that he would be, as had been the case with the Missouri legal system from the Missouri Mormon War, Joe wanted people on the outside who were not subject to Illinois state laws to carry out the next exodus and to follow his directions. You see, Bloody Brigham Young, working under direction of Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith, that made a formidable team to run the church via communications from Joe while he was in prison. Joe knew that those two men together would be able to organize and execute the next exodus to the Rocky Mountains. And once Joe was somehow able to escape this legal scrape, like he'd escaped every other legal scrape in his life, the people would be in a new location, ready and primed for the return of their great and glorious leader, like had happened in Missouri when they had their third mass exodus to Illinois, and they built their kingdom on the Mississippi, right? Joe also sent Hingepin Sidney Rigdon out of the city. Now, it had been decided that Rigdon would be Joe's vice presidential nominee after the numerous people that they petitioned to be vice president all fell through. Rigdon needed to be outside of Illinois to be able to coordinate continued electioneering and to get the vote of constituents in his home state of Pennsylvania, and to help coordinate with Brigham and Hiram the next Mormon exodus. If war broke out between the Mormons and the Illinoisans, the election of 1844, the presidential election, that was still expected to take place, and Joe could leverage the persecution narrative from his jail cell to explode a populist platform that he was in the process of building. Nothing motivates extremist elements in a population more than investigations caused by fake news anti-Mormons, right? Rigdon did set out for Pittsburgh on the steamer Osprey, and his leaving the city of Nauvoo was even noticed by the Warsaw Signal, who also noted, quote, about 100 other Mormons who are making tracks for the lower country, end quote. These movements of the Mormon leadership were regarded with merited skepticism and suspicion by the anti-Mormons in the surrounding cities. There could only be a few reasons why Joe would be sending his closest and most trusted advisors out of the city, because he would never do something like that unless it was strategic, right? So was he moving them out of Nauvoo in preparation for the surrender of the city and himself? Or was he doing it so that they wouldn't be in danger should war break out? If war did break out, Joe had his plants all over the country who could persuade the public and politicians in other states that the actions of the anti-Mormons and the anti-Mormon Governor Ford were all baseless religious persecution. Everything was calculated. Speaking of calculated, the anti-Mormons were running assessments of what the coming Illinois Mormon War might look like. From the Warsaw Signal, quote, 250 men mastered arms yesterday at this place. troops are gathering from other counties in Carthage. About 300 are now encamped in that place, ready for action. The Mormons say that they have 4,000 well-drilled troops. We have just learned by a gentleman from Keokuk that they have organized a company of volunteers in that place and appointed a committee of vigilance and a committee for safety. Provisions have been made by our citizens to furnish all persons coming from a distance with provisions, end quote. This was published in the Warsaw Signal. All of this stuff that we've been talking about here, this was all published the day before Governor Ford arrived in Carthage to handle the situation personally. And accordingly, the Signal stated, quote, "No news yet of a definite character from the governor. It was rumored in Quincy that the militia are ordered out, but no reliance is placed in the truth of it," end quote. You see, the Mormon militia was a massive force to be reckoned with. And the non-Mormon militias who were tasked with fighting the Mormons in the coming war were well aware that the Mormons retained a superior force unbounded by the laws with which regular militias were forced to comply. Once branded a rebellious force and treasonous, the Mormons could sustain themselves by pillaging the local towns. The state militias needed to be supported by provisions acquired through legal means provided by the state itself. So if we're doing this calculations, if we're sizing up the militaries and their available supplies, the Mormons win 5-1 every day of the week. And that was known by the Mormon leadership and Joe himself, and obviously by the anti-Mormons, right? If battle broke out, it would require mustering entire armies from multiple states under the direction of the federal government to answer the power of the Mormon forces. There's simply no denying the absolute Mormon superiority in military power here, which made everything a much greater and more realistic threat. Governor Ford, however, as governor, he had technical total control over the Nauvoo Legion as granted by the Nauvoo Charter. However, various provisions in the Nauvoo Charter had been disposed of or ignored when they presented an inconvenience or an obstacle, and the provision that granted Governor Ford total control of the Legion, that provision would share a similar fate as all these other inconvenient provisions. The anti-Mormons recognized this disparity in militia sizes, and they also understood that only Governor Ford stood a chance of nullifying the martial law orders in Nauvoo and reining in the expansive powers of Joe's private militia. So Thomas Coke Sharp printed in the Warsaw Signal, quote, "When the governor learns that Nauvoo is under martial law, if he does not act, there is no need of a governor," end quote. The implication there being that if Ford doesn't bring the Legion into his control, the Nauvoo Legion, then all semblance of law is completely irrelevant and we're at war. And it doesn't matter if the governor is here or not, right? So Governor Ford's arrival in Carthage on the 21st of June was widely celebrated by the anti-Mormons. Ford exchanged letters with Joseph Smith and he set up, his officers in tents around the city of Carthage. Ford realized the immediacy and the danger of the situation once he spent some time talking to citizens in Carthage and receiving intel from all around Hancock and Adams counties about what was going on. And as Ford stated in his History of Illinois, a lot of the information that he heard was unsubstantiated rumors, and it was hard for him to know what was and wasn't true. At a time when two groups of people are itching for war, verifiable information is scant, valuable, and it comes at a premium and often comes too late. From the Signal, quote, "News has just been received from Carthage that the governor arrived there in the morning and addressed the people in the course of the day. He takes decided ground against the Mormons, assuring the people that he would take measures to check their lawless course and to thoroughly investigate all the charges alleged against them. and to bring them to punishment. He addressed a letter to the mayor and council of Nauvoo asking them to send him 2 of their most discreet citizens to make such explanations of their recent conduct as they may have to offer and to come unarmed or he would not receive them. As a means of defense, and to the end that Joe Smith may not dictate his own terms, the governor has ordered out the 4th Brigade of the militia, part of the force to be stationed at Carthage, and the balance at Warsaw, and to take such measures for the security of these places as the commanding officers may deem necessary. A message was also dispatched by the governor to Alton with an order for all the arms in the state arsenal to be transported to Warsaw and used in arming the people. End quote. You see, with a militia of 4,000 armed men drilling and marching throughout the city of Nauvoo, ready to go to battle, it didn't matter if Governor Ford was a governor. Joe had more leverage. He had more guys with guns, and he had proved himself repeatedly above the law. The force of Governor Ford's words and orders not enforced by his own state militia didn't carry much weight. Beyond that, if war broke out and the situation actually went disastrously wrong, there was absolutely no security for Governor Ford's own life, right? The Mormons had attempted to kill a governor once already. What's another governor added to the rap sheet of an already lawless group of tens of thousands of people? Governor Ford also knew that certain close allies of the prophet would not be welcome in Carthage, even if Ford had ensured them of safe passage between the cities. So one of Joe's Danites, Almon Babbitt, arrived in Nauvoo from Carthage on the morning of the 22nd of June with intel direct from Governor Ford. Quote, Almon Babbitt arrived from Carthage this morning at request of the governor, who thought it not wisdom to have Willard Richards and William Wines, Doubled Up Phelps, etc., city council to go to Carthage and best to let people pass in and out of the city. End quote. So even the list of people that Ford could grant safe passage was limited because so many of Joe's closest cronies were such pariahs anywhere other than Nauvoo. After Almon Babbitt told Joe about the situation, Joe wrote a letter for Governor Ford, and he sent it with another set of affidavits with Lucian Woodworth, quote, who was designated to go in place of Dr. Richards, end quote. Because Governor Ford is like, Dr. Richards, if you send Willard Richards or William Wines Phelps here, they're going to die. Don't send those guys. Send some discreet guys, right? The contents of this letter laid out the arguments from Joseph Smith himself, instead of being passed through these discreet liaison officers who are now taking meetings with Governor Ford to communicate his will to the prophet, right? Quote, this is Joseph Smith's letter to Governor Ford, the first of 3 letters that we're going to be reading today. We're going to spend some time on letters, okay? We still got quite a long script to get through today. I hope you don't mind, listeners. You're stuck at home, you're not doing anything, right? What's a slightly longer than regular podcast. All right. Quote, to His Excellency Thomas Ford, Governor. Dear Sir, I this morning forward you the remainder of the affidavits which are ready to present to you by the hands of a gentleman who is fully competent, Lucian Woodworth, to give you information on the whole subject, which has been the cause of the origin of our present difficulties. I would respectfully recommend the bearer, Colonel Woodworth, as one of my aides and a man whose testimony can be relied upon. I presume you are already convinced that it would be altogether unsafe for me or any of the city council to come to Carthage. An account of the vast excitement which has been got up by false report and libelous publications, nothing could afford me a greater pleasure than a privilege of investigating the whole subject before your excellency in person, for I have ever held myself in readiness to comply with your orders and answer for my proceedings before any legal tribunal in the state. I would hereby respectfully pray your excellency to come to Nauvoo, if congenial with your feelings, and give us a privilege of laying the whole matter before you in its true colors, and where abundance of testimony can be forthcoming to prove every point of by disinterested persons, men of character and of worth and notoriety, strangers who were here all the time. But I am satisfied your excellency does not wish men to expose the lives of the citizens of this place by requiring them to put themselves into the power of an infuriated, bloodthirsty mob, a part of whom have already several times fired upon our people without the least shadow of cause or provocation. Once again, no evidence for that. I can't find any verifiable information, verifiable evidence of that. It's just yet one more of the rumors that was boiled up, came out of all of this conflict and controversy. But it is an interesting point. We can't go to Carthage and tell you our side of the story. Please come to Nauvoo and everybody here will tell you what's going on. We'll tell you the true side instead of your mind being swayed by those Carthaginian mobocrats, right? Joe continues. I'm informed this morning that some gentleman has made affidavit that he had a private conversation with me in which I stated that I had secret correspondence with you, etc. If any person has been wicked enough to do this, he is a perjured villain. For in the first place, I do not suffer myself to hold private conversation with any stranger. No, Joseph Smith is not one for secret combinations, is he? And in the second place, I have never even intimated anything of the kind as having secret correspondence with your excellency. I don't know what that's about. I don't know who alleged that Joseph Smith and Governor Ford had secret conversations. I don't know who's saying anything about that. I can't find any affidavit that actually refers to that. I have no idea what he's referring to there, but I have a feeling like it was important enough in Joseph Smith's mind that he had to put in print his denial of that allegation. He continues. Our troubles are invariably brought upon us by falsehoods and misrepresentations by designing men. We have ever held ourselves amenable to the law. Yeah, no, Joseph Smith, he's a good law-abiding guy. And for myself, sire, I am ever ready to conform to and support the laws and Constitution, even at the expense of my life. Those may be the most hollow words I've ever heard come from this man. I have never in the least offered any resistance to law or lawful process, which is a well-known fact to the public. It's just a lie. All of which circumstances make us the more anxious to have you come to Nauvoo and investigate the whole matter. Now, sir, is it not an easy matter to distinguish between those who have pledged themselves to exterminate innocent men, women, and children, and those who have only stood in their own defense and in defense of their innocent families? And that, too, in accordance with the Constitution and the laws of the country as required by the oaths and as good as law-abiding citizens? In regard to the destruction of the press, the truth only need to be presented before your excellency to satisfy you of the justice of the proceedings. The press was established by a set of men who had already set themselves at defiance of the law and authorities of the city. He's talking about the Nauvoo Expositor, of course, right? And had threatened the lives of some of its principal officers, and who also made it no private matter that the press was established for the express purpose of destroying the city, as will be shown by the affidavit of Joseph Jackson, and as they stated to me in their threats. There we go. Joseph Smith has these two affidavits that he somehow got from Joseph Jackson, even though they weren't successful in arresting him. Joseph Jackson made the affidavits that the people are firing on him. But here he's now including those affidavits. Somebody who was apparently trying to kill him, who was on the grassy knoll, who nearly killed Joseph Smith, seen reloading his pistols. Now Joseph Smith is deciding, I'm going to use Joseph Jackson's words, selectively because they're beneficial. Here, take these two affidavits from Joseph Jackson. But also notably, the people who set up the printing press, they had already set themselves at defiance of the laws and had threatened the lives of some of its principal officers. They were also the same people who warned Joseph Smith that Jackson was trying to kill him when he was at Hamilton's hotel back on May 27th. Right? If they really wanted Joseph Smith dead, they wouldn't have told him that there was a plan to kill him. It's not consistent. That's really what the point is here, is this is not consistent. Mr. Babbitt informs me that reports are in circulation that we have taken property which belongs to the Mr. Law and others. The property being whatever was in that desk that was destroyed or stolen or whatever in addition to the printing press, right? That's something we discussed back 2 weeks ago when we were talking about the second hearing that Joseph Smith had. There has been no property meddled with, to my knowledge, belonging to any person except property we have purchased of the rightful owners. Mr. Law turned over some property to a Mr. Hicks to pay a debt. This I purchased of Mr. Hicks, and I am responsible to him for the amount. We have been especially careful to preserve the property of those who are exciting the public against us. No, we didn't steal any of our enemies' property. No, we would never do that, would we? We're Mormons. We're good, upstanding citizens. Inasmuch as we know that every means would be used which could be invented to raise excitement, and we have appointed the police to watch his property and see that no harm was done to it by any person as they had tried to fire their own building and was detected in the act, the fire was extinguished by the policeman and no property damaged. There's so much to unpack in that, right? We put a guard in front of William Law's property because we wanted to be sure that any of the enemies of us, of the leadership, didn't have ammunition against us to raise excitement of the public against us. And we put out a police guard there to watch the property because the person who owned it, William Law, tried to set fire to his own building so that he could claim that it was the Mormons who did this, that it was the Mormon leadership who destroyed his property. But luckily, because the policemen were there guarding the property, the fire was extinguished by the policemen and no property was damaged. None of this makes sense unless a whole bunch of it is lies. That's the whole point here, right? There are lies in here, and now it's just a matter of what is a lie, what is true, what was actually happening, and who can we trust more, Governor Ford or the people who are claiming that Joseph Smith was destroying their property and destroyed their press and stealing some of their property? Do we believe Joseph Smith? Do we believe the prophet because he's just such a stand-up guy? Who do we believe in all of this? Joseph wraps his letter to Thomas Ford by saying, "There have been no prisoners taken in this city, neither any person held as hostage, only some who are residents of this place who had broke the laws. No stranger has been interfered with nor detained in the city under any circumstances. In haste, I have the honor to remain, dear sir, your most obedient servant, Joseph Smith." End quote. That final point is crucial here because that nullifies the accusations. Well, it attempts to nullify the accusations that martial law was declared. And the affidavit of the guy earlier, the Cameron guy, who had been detained in Nauvoo, who wasn't allowed passage until he swore the oath that he wasn't an enemy of the Mormons, that he wasn't a Carthaginian, that he wasn't a spy, that he's just there on business. That guy, Joseph Smith, wrote that little paragraph just to say that that person lied. None of that's true. We've never detained anybody. We didn't arrest anybody for the riot. Nobody here is arrested under martial law. Nobody's rights are being infringed on. No stranger has been interfered with nor detained in the city under any circumstances. Which, once again, do we believe Joseph Smith? Has he demonstrated a history of reliable testimony and when the law is against him telling the truth? Or do we believe the affidavit of the guy who was just a traveler who maybe hated the Mormons? Maybe he didn't. Maybe he was just a victim of circumstance passing through the city. Who knows? Who do we really trust in this? That was Joe's letter to Governor Ford. And then as Lucian Woodworth left the morning of June 22nd with this letter and a new set of affidavits, including the affidavits from Joseph Jackson, which how those affidavits were acquired is a mystery to me. Lucian Woodworth set out to Carthage to meet with Governor Ford. More affidavits were collected. Many of those affidavits that were collected while Lucian Woodworth was on this meeting, traveling for this meeting. Many of these affidavits were concerning the anti-Mormons who had fired on Joseph Jackson and a bunch of other Mormons that they were headed to Nauvoo. Now, were Mormons actually fired on? Did this really happen? Were the anti-Mormons just indiscriminately shooting at anybody who was walking down the road who looked like a Mormon? We can't know for sure, right? Because it's equally plausible that they did shoot at Jackson and other Mormons as it is that the affidavits were completely fabricated to give weight to the claim that the Mormons were acting in self-defense instead of the aggressors in the fight here, right? I'm just going to take a selection of just a few of these. There's an affidavit from Edward Robinson stated that he had, quote, heard several persons who had assembled together for warlike purposes, having their arms and one cannon with them, say that they were gathering together for the purpose of destroying the property of General Joseph Smith, and finally said they would destroy the town and exterminate the Latter-day Saints, end quote. James Olive made an affidavit claiming, quote, There was a man by the name of Milton Hamilton came into my house and told me he had come to tell me to arm and equip myself according to the law and stand in readiness, that the governor had demanded Joseph Smith according to law, and that he would not come, meaning that Joseph Smith would not surrender, that the general had issued orders for the militia to be in readiness to take said Smith. I asked him what general, and he observed he believed it was Colonel Levi Williams, end quote. Levi Williams, of course, he's our anti-Mormon poster child who is going to stand trial after Carthage for murdering Joseph and Hiram Smith. Levi Williams was a bit of a loose cannon, right? George G. Johnstone claimed in his affidavit here that, quote, the governor had sent orders for the militia to be called out for today and to start on the 22nd to Carthage, there to wait until all were ready from the different counties in the state, and then they should march out to the prairie. They should stop on the prairie and send a flag of truce to Nauvoo and demand the body of General Joseph Smith. If the people of Nauvoo refused to give him up, then they should exterminate the whole of them, end quote. A guy named Lumen Calkins claimed that, quote, there were about 7,000 men ready in Missouri to join the Illinois anti-Mormons to exterminate all who believed on Joseph Smith, end quote. And this guy, Lumen Calkins, further alleged that the Die Vernon, that's the steamer that was refused landing at Nauvoo, that all the passengers were, quote, none but spies who came on purpose to see the places in order to know how to strike when the time comes to strike, end quote, giving justification for the Nauvoo, under martial law, for Nauvoo officers to tell the steamer that it can't land at Nauvoo for the night. Fascinating stuff. Calkins added some personal theater to his affidavit. I find this pretty interesting. He relates a conversation with one of these anti-Mormons that he supposedly shared. This conversation with this guy from Missouri, quote, he said he should stay in Nauvoo and carry on his butchering as usual, as if there was nothing taking place, that he had as good a gun as any man ever put to his face, and that the first shot he should fire would be to kill Joseph and Hiram. You got to curve the bullet. Said I, the people will surely kill you then. He replied, he would rush straight through 1,000 people to wash his hands in Joseph's blood, and especially in Hiram's, if he was to be immediately cut into 1,000 pieces. He said he should be willing to die as soon as he had killed them, end quote. Yeah, I'm sure that's exactly how this conversation went with this unnamed Missourian anti-Mormon who followed them from Missouri to Illinois and wanted to stay in Nauvoo so that he could butcher all the Mormons and then wash his hands in Joe's blood like a Sylvester Stallone movie. It's bonkers. It's off the wall. It's almost, dare I say, unbelievable. With all of these new affidavits, and I just chose a few. I mean, there's over a dozen of affidavits making similar allegations. Nauvoo's martial law orders went on high alert, and Joe issued an order to Major General Jonathan Dunham. Quote, Sir, you will proceed without delay to the assistance of the Nauvoo Legion to prepare the background of said city for defense against an invasion by mobs. Cause the Legion to be furnished with tents and make your encampment in the vicinity of your labors. End quote. Battle formations, that's what that is. And accordingly, Jonathan Dunham called out as many regiments of the Legion as he could to, quote, work by turns 3 or 4 hours each with entrenching tools and to make the best measures in case of an attack. I also gave orders that a standard be prepared for the nations, end quote. So now, armed officers were not only patrolling the city, but now they are digging trenches around the outer areas that are vulnerable to attack for a proper battle. Something they should have been doing for like 2 weeks by this point, but nonetheless, late is better than never to construct city defenses, right? And finally, at 10 o'clock this evening of June 22nd, 1844, Joe finally received an extensive letter from Governor Ford. This letter details Governor Ford's views of the situation since his arrival the day before and collecting a ton of intel, taking dozens of meetings, and reading a ton of affidavits and putting all the pieces together in his mind. And all of this at his tent headquarters in Carthage. We're going to read through this entire letter. And I could make a reasonable argument that we have never read a more consequential letter on this podcast in 5.5 years and 207 episodes of serialized history. Because Governor Ford details all of the arguments that Joseph Smith was infringing on the law, why they were illegal, his view of the situation. And in many ways, Governor Ford in this one letter summarizes everything that we've been discussing on the podcast for about the past 2 to 3 months of episodes. We're going to read it. We're going to tease apart a couple of elements as we go. And then we're eventually going to read Joe's reply. Here we go. Quote, to the mayor and council of the city of Nauvoo. Gentlemen, after examining carefully all the allegations on the part of the citizens of the country in Hancock County and the defensive matters submitted to me by the committee of your citizens concerning the existing disturbances, I find that there appears to be but little contradiction as to important facts, so that it may be safely assumed that the immediate cause of the existing excitement is the destruction of the press and fixtures of the Nauvoo Expositor, and the subsequent refusal of the individuals accused to be accountable therefor, according to the general laws of this state, and the insisting on your parts to be accountable only before your own municipal court and according to the ordinances of your city. One paragraph, he summarized why the recent excitement, the existing excitement, is so intense, and he lays it right at the feet of the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor. Not what was said in the Nauvoo Expositor, but the destruction of the press. And that's a really notable fact in this, that it wasn't the crime, it was the covering up of the crime that became the real issue with the people here. Destroying the printing press was the major issue. And he says, I find little contradiction as to important facts. And those are the facts. You destroyed the Expositor printing press. You refused on your part to be accountable only before your own municipal court and the ordinances of your city. That's the problem. You were not accountable to the circuit court. You handled it in your own municipal court, and it was a crime to begin with. He continues. Many other facts have been asserted on both sides as tending to increase the excitement, but as they mostly relate merely to private persons and committed by individuals and tend simply to show the present state of affairs, I will not further notice them in this communication. Now that's, of course, everything else. That's Jackson standing there on the grassy knoll. That's the people apparently shooting at the Mormons. That's the people who are trying to claim that they want to wash their hands in Hiram's and Joseph's blood. That's all of the excitement that's going on. That's the Mormons apparently pillaging and stealing property from the nearby non-Mormon settlements. There are many, many issues that are all wrapped up into this. And he says, I will not further notice them in this communication. And because they tend to simply to show the present state of affairs. All of these things are the consequences of the Expositor press. We're going to focus on the problem of the press being burnt, right? He continues, the material facts to be noticed are that a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor was established in Nauvoo, that this newspaper was deemed offensive to the people of that city, that the Common Council, without notice or process to the owners, entered into a trial and heard statements not under oath and evidence which was under oath in relation to the character of that paper and in relation to the character, conduct, and designs of the owners and editors of the press, that upon hearing such statements and evidence, the Common Council passed an ordinance or resolution declaring said press and paper to be a public nuisance and ordered the same to be abated as such. That's the big problem, right? Common Council met together. They didn't allow any testimony of the proprietors of it. They didn't give them any notice. They just met in Common Council for a couple of days. Then they passed a resolution. And by that night, there was a fire in the street, right? He continues, that a writ was issued by the mayor to the marshal of the city for that purpose, that a military order was issued at the same time by the mayor, who is also lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, to the major general in the command of that legion for a force sufficient to ensure the execution of the writ aforesaid. So not only did you burn the printing press, but you called out your police force, as well as the Nauvoo Legion in order to effect it. That's a military order then. If you're calling out the militia to effect your orders, that makes you a military commander, right? He says, it appears also that the press was destroyed in obedience to the foregoing ordinance and writ according to a return on the same by the marshal in the following words. Now quoting the return from John P. Green that we read on the podcast back when we discussed the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor, quote, that within press and type is destroyed and pied according to order on this 10th day of June, 1844, at about 6:00 p.m., signed John P. Green, City Marshal, end quote. We read that on the podcast. That's in the history of the church, word for word. And that shows that Governor Ford had access to the bedrock documents that proved guilt in this affair, right? He also says, and he continues in the letter, it appears also that the owners of the press obtained from a justice of the peace at Carthage, Judge Morrison, a warrant against the authors of this destruction for a riot, that the constable charged with execution of this process arrested some of the persons accused, who immediately obtained writs of habeas corpus from the municipal court by your city, by virtue of which they were tried in Nauvoo and discharged from arrest, and that they have ever since refused to be arrested or submit to a trial at any other place or before any other court, except in the city and before the municipal court aforesaid. So, not only did you commit the act of tyranny that incited a riot, but when you were arrested by the constable who came into your city from Carthage, you refused to follow his process and instead granted yourself a writ of habeas corpus, and then you further refused, after you had your own municipal court trial, you further refused to go to any other court except for your own municipal court. That is the major issue. You are not accountable to yourself if you break laws. That's not how society works. That's what Governor Ford is saying. He continues, it has also been reported to me that martial law has been declared in Nauvoo, that persons and property have been and now forcibly imprisoned and detained there, and that the Legion has been ordered under arms to resist any attempt to arrest the persons accused. I have not particularly inquired into the truth of these latter reports, for although they may become matters of great importance in the sequel, that's all caps, that's Governor Ford shouting at Joe, they are not necessary to be ascertained and acted upon at present. So, that's an important point. I hear that you declared martial law and that you are telling your Nauvoo Legionnaires that if anybody comes into town to arrest you, that you arrest that person. That I don't have enough information to determine if that's real, but if it is, Joe, I'm going to tell you that's going to be of great importance really soon, even though I can't ascertain right now if those are actual facts. But if those are true, we got a serious problem here, dude. Ford continues. This is why I respect and admire Governor Ford a lot, is he is just bare bone, he is stone cold, he is down to facts, and he had enough time and enough diligence to collect the information and make an intelligent assessment of what has happened, what is happening, and how to deal with this as the governor, right? He continues, I now express to you my opinion that your conduct in the destruction of the press was a very gross outrage upon the laws and the liberties of the people. It may have been full of libels, but this did not authorize you to destroy it. There are many newspapers in this state which have been wrongfully abusing me for more than a year, and yet such is my regard for the liberty of the press and the rights of a free people in a republican government that I would shed the last drop of my blood to protect those presses from any illegal violence. You have violated the Constitution in at least 4 particulars. You have violated that part of it which declares that the printing presses shall be free, being responsible for the abuse thereof, and that the truth may be given in evidence. This article of the Constitution contemplates that the proprietors of a libelous press may be sued for private damages or may be indicted criminally, and that upon trial they should have the right to give the truth in evidence. In this case, the proprietors had no notice of the proceeding. He's absolutely right. You didn't even call them in your sham court where you declared that their press was a public nuisance and destroyed it. You didn't even hear their testimonies. You did not handle this correctly. Look, the press journalists are responsible for what they print, right? And they can be sued in the civil courts, and they can be thrown in jail for saying things that are inaccurate, that are false, that are libelous, that are defamatory. But the truth is in the evidence. You didn't give them a chance to even present their own truth. You just made up your own truth. Do you not see how that's a problem, Joseph Smith? He goes on. The Constitution also provides that the people shall be protected against unreasonable searches and seizures of their property, and that no man shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property except by judgment of his peers, which means a jury trial, and the law of the land, which means due process of the law, and a notice to the accused. You have also violated the Constitution and your own charter in this. Your council, which has no judicial powers and can only pass ordinances of a general nature, have undertaken to pass judgment as a court and convict without a jury a press of being libelous and a nuisance to the city. The council at most could only define a nuisance by general ordinance and leave it to the courts to determine whether individuals or particulars accused come within such definition. The Constitution abhors and will not tolerate the union of legislative and judicial powers in the same body of magistracy, because, as in this case, they will first make a tyrannical law and then execute it in a tyrannical manner. Ooh, those big, scary T words, tyrannical law in a tyrannical manner. Tyranny, it's a scary term, but it's absolutely fitting of the events. What Governor Ford is decrying here are the fundamental separation of powers encapsulated in the Constitution of the United States. The legislative branch is separate and distinct from the judicial branch. Because if those are the same, then you get a single group of individuals making laws and then executing laws and then adjudicating the validity of those laws in the same breath. That's what he's saying is the major problem here. You have brought together the legislative and the judicial powers into one body, and you did so and made a tyrannical law and executed it in a tyrannical manner. You have also assumed to yourselves more power than you are entitled to in relation to writs of habeas under your charter. I know that you have been told by lawyers for the purpose of gaining your favor that you have this power to any extent. In this, they have deceived you for their own base purposes. Your charter supposes that you may pass ordinances, a breach of which will result in the imprisonment of the offender. This is a super important point. I'm going to read one more paragraph from him. For the purpose of ensuring more speedy relief to such persons, authority was given to the municipal court to issue writs of habeas corpus in all cases arising under the ordinances of the city. It was never supposed by the legislature, nor can the language of your charter be tortured to mean that a jurisdiction was intended to be conferred which would apply to all cases of imprisonment under the general laws of the state or of the United States, as well as the city ordinances. This is a super important point, because it is tapping into one of the massive issues that the anti-Mormons, quote unquote, anti-Mormons had with Joseph Smith and the Mormon settlement. Not only did the Nauvoo City Council practice such expansive tyrannical powers, but the many, many resolutions and ordinances which were passed, which expanded the powers of writs of habeas corpus in the city, were also repugnant to the concept of habeas corpus. Because your city doesn't just get to write a special law for you, Joseph Smith, that says, if anybody enters your city to arrest you, that you get a writ of habeas corpus. That's not how the system of laws works, because if it did, then we would end up with little fiefdoms run by tyrants. which is great for the tyrant until it's not anymore, right? That really is a crucial point here. And he says it so perfectly. The language of your charter can't be tortured to mean that you have jurisdiction as you claim that you do. And Joseph's use of writs of habeas corpus, that was one of those underlying issues that people kind of bristled against, but they didn't really have the ability to deal with. But he's bringing it up here. Governor Ford is bringing this up because Joseph Smith had been released on the writ of habeas corpus when that constable was issued from Carthage to arrest Joseph Smith for burning the printing press, right? He used that writ of habeas corpus one too many times, apparently. There must be a sweet ground, a middle spot, of number of times that you can use these tyrannical powers before you overstay your welcome with them. Governor Ford has very clearly worn out his patience with Joseph Smith. He continues. It has also been reserved to you to make that the discovery of a newspaper charged to be scurrilous and libelous may be legally abated or removed as a nuisance. In no other state, county, city, town, or territory in the United States has ever such a thing been thought of before. Such an act at this day would not be tolerated even in England. Just such another act in 1830 hurled the King of France from his throne and caused the imprisonment of 4 of his principal ministers for life. No civilized country can tolerate such conduct, much less can it be tolerated in this free country of the United States. Super important point. You can't just say that a newspaper is libelous and then destroy it. You can't just do that because we have freedom of speech here. No civilized country can tolerate such conduct. Recently, the King of France was hurled from his throne for doing what you just did. Maybe a little prophetic on Governor Ford's part. The result of my deliberations on this subject is that I will have to require you and all persons in Nauvoo accused or sued to submit in all cases implicitly to the process of the courts and to interpose no obstacles to an arrest either by writ of habeas corpus or otherwise, and that all of the people of the city of Nauvoo shall make and continue the most complete submission to the laws of the state and the process of the courts and justices of the peace. In the particular case now under consideration, I require any and all of you who are or shall be accused to submit yourself to be arrested by the same constable by virtue of the same warrant and be tried before the magistrate whose authority has heretofore been resisted. Nothing short of this can vindicate the dignity of violated law and allay the just excitement of the people. That is a super important detail that Governor Ford says there. Whatever you did with your writ of habeas corpus and having the trials in your little municipal court fiefdom, you know what? I can ignore those things if you just comply with the initial arrest warrant issued by the same constable who attempted to arrest you in the first place, Constable Bettisworth, right? If you just comply with that order, I can forget about the whole stuff that you did with the municipal court and writs of habeas corpus and then having the prisoners discharged like you happened, two hearings in a week's time. I can ignore that. If you just adhere to the laws, if you just follow the laws, then I can forget stuff. I can forget how tyrannical and how much tyrannical power you have. Continuing on. I am anxious to preserve the peace. A small indiscretion may bring on war. The whole country is now up in arms, and a vast number of people are ready to take the matter into their own hands. Such a state of things might force me to call out the militia to prevent a civil war, and such is the excitement of the country that I fear that the militia, when assembled, would be beyond legal control. You are wrong in the first instance, and I can call out no portion of the militia for your defense until you submit to the law. You have made it necessary that a posse should be assembled to execute legal process, and that posse, as fast as it assembles, is in danger of being imbued with the mobocratic spirit. If you, by refusing to submit, shall make it necessary to call out the militia, I have great fears that your city will be destroyed and your people, many of them, exterminated. You know the excitement of the public mind. Do not tempt it too far. A very little matter may do a very great injury, and if you are disposed to continue the causes of excitement and render a force necessary to coerce submission, I would say that your city was built, as it were, upon kegs of powder, which a very little spark may explode. It is my intention to do all I can to preserve peace. And even if obliged to call the militia to prosecute the war so as not to involve the innocent and comprehend all in the same punishment. But excitement is a matter which grows very fast upon men when assembled. The affair, I much fear, may assume a revolutionary character, and the men may disregard the authority of their officers. I tell you plainly that if no such submission to the arrest warrant is made, as I have indicated, I will be obliged to call out the militia, and if a few thousands will not be sufficient, many thousands it will be. I sincerely hope that your people may do nothing which will make such a proceeding necessary. I hope also that they will be well disposed to cooperate with me in allaying the excitement of the public mind. Immediately discharge. Hang on. I'll get to that in a second, but let me just comment on the point that he just now made, because that is super important as well. I'm here as governor. I'm commander-in-chief of state militias, but the people here hate you so much that I don't know if I can control them. So if you don't submit to an arrest warrant, I'm going to be forced to call out the militia. And I'm probably not going to be able to control them. If you don't submit to that arrest by Constable Bettesworth, sworn out by the arrest warrant of Judge Morrison from Carthage, if you don't come to Carthage, the whole state is going to fall on Nauvoo. And if we can't effect that arrest with a few thousand, many thousands it will be. I'm calling your bluff, Joe. Immediately discharge such persons as you have under martial law. Let them go without molestation. Abstain from all injury to private property. Let people go where they please without swearing them first to take no part against you. All such proceedings tend only to inflame the public mind and raise up 10 men disposed to fight you for every one thus foolishly disabled. Your committee assures me that you are sincerely desirous of preserving the peace, and if so, I hope you will cooperate with me in everything necessary to allay the excitement of the minds of the people. So that whole thing with the Cameron guy, it said that he was detained and he had to give the false oath before he was granted passage out of the city of Nauvoo, even though he was only there on business. He had to say, I've never been an enemy to the church. I'm only here on business. I'm not a Carthaginian. I'm not a spy, I promise. And then they would let him go. Governor Ford takes that a step further. He says, anytime you do that, you just raise up 10 men who are more interested in killing you for every one person that you momentarily inconvenienced. But then he takes it a step further and he says, the following named persons are reported to me as being detained against their will by martial law. John A. Hicks, H.O. Norton, A.J. Higbee, John Eagle, P.J. Rolfe, Peter Lemon, and T.J. Rolfe. 7 men who were arrested under martial law. It will tend greatly to allay excitement if they shall be immediately discharged and suffered to go without molestation. Joe, you know that you have no reason to hold these people and absolutely no legal justification to hold these people. Just because you suspect them as being spies doesn't give you powers to keep them in a jail cell. Release them, you monstrous idiot. He goes on. It is also reported here and generally believed, but whether truly or not I have not learned, that there are many foraging parties abroad from Nauvoo committing depredations upon the cattle and property in the vicinity. These acts, if correctly reported, must absolutely cease immediately if you expect any person here to have the power to preserve the peace. That was one of the main problems with the Missouri Mormon War that caused Governor Lilburn Boggs to sign the extermination order in the first place, was the Mormons pillaging and burning the local non-Mormon settlements because they didn't have enough provisions to survive the winter and carry out a war of attrition against the state of Missouri. If there were, as Governor Ford says, foraging parties committing depredations upon the cattle and property in the vicinity, you have to stop that now, or I can't do anything for you. In case the persons accused should make no resistance to an arrest, it will be against order to be accompanied by others. If it should become necessary to have witnesses on the trials, I will see that such persons may thus be brought to this place from Nauvoo, either for trial or as witnesses for the accused. If the individual... Joe, look, we're going to arrest you. If you try and bring your posse into town under arrest, it's not going to work, man. If it's just you and Hiram who are arrested here, I can protect the two of you. If you try to come into town with a posse, you're all dead. That is an important point. And we're going to have witnesses on your behalf. And when that time comes, when you're standing trial, I'm going to bring those witnesses in from Nauvoo and grant them safe passage. Don't bring those people with you. That's only going to make it more exciting. And then he wraps his letter with arguably the most crucial line in all of this that summarizes the excitement and the extent to which things were spiraling out of hand. He says, if the individuals accused, Joseph and Hiram, cannot be found when required by the constable, it will be considered by me as an equivalent to a refusal to be arrested, and the militia will be ordered accordingly. I am, gentlemen, with great respect, your obedient servant, signed Thomas Ford, Governor and Commander-in-Chief. End quote. I really like Governor Thomas Ford. And I feel bad that he was caught up in this situation for a few reasons. One, this was not his fight. Right? He didn't have a dog in this fight. He didn't like the Mormons. He didn't hate the Mormons. They were just his constituents and he had to deal with it. Two, this was unexpected. He knew that the Mormons had been a problem in Missouri. He knew that the Mormons had been something that his predecessor, Governor Thomas Carlin, had dealt with quite a lot, shared a lot of letters, had, made certain concessions to, provide a place for the Mormons to settle. It was not his issue. He inherited a growing disaster that he was now in the thick of trying to sort out the mess. And three, he's a good person. He's a generally moral person, and he has the intelligence and the acumen, and more importantly, the legal background. He was a lawyer before he was elected, to understand what was wrong, why this was wrong, and why the criminals were guilty of the crimes that they had committed, if all the allegations of facts were true. Governor Ford didn't deserve this. And more importantly, his political career after this whole Mormon affair died. It was gone. It was gone. He never held office after he finished his tenure as governor of Illinois. This was the death of his political career. Issues which were completely out of his hand, completely out of his control. He was just trying to sort out a mess, and he was branded from that time forward as an ineffective governor. It's not fair. And it really sucks because he obviously had his head bolted on straight. He knew what he was talking about. He knew the issues. He had talked to enough people. He had done his homework and his due diligence to try and understand the facts as best as possible at a time when he didn't have entire compendiums of history and compile letter exchanges to read these things online or in print form to see what was going on with hindsight. He was making judgment calls on the fly in very short amount of time with limited information, and he was making the right calls. And still, he suffered for it. But after reading this scathing and accurate letter from Governor Ford, Joe stayed up until midnight writing a reply with the help of Double Dub Phelps, one of his chief propaganda ministers and one of his ghostwriters. And Joe attempted to answer each and every point made by Governor Ford in that letter. So let's see how well Joe does in his own defense of everything that Governor Ford just went through. Quote, "Sir, yours of this date is received by Messrs. Taylor and Bernheisel. A part of the same delegation, Mr. Woodworth, who was detained yesterday, started for Carthage at 12 noon this date, whom we perceived had not arrived at your last date," his last letter. "Some documents conveyed by him would tend to counteract some of the views expressed by your excellency in his communication. And we feel confident if all the facts could be before your excellency, you would have come to different conclusions. Our insisting to be accountable only before our own municipal court is totally incorrect." Here we go. Here we go. Here comes Joseph Smith, master gaslighter. All right. "We plead a habeas corpus as a last resort to save us from being thrown into the power of the mobocrats who are then threatening us with death. And it was with great reluctance we went before the municipal court on account of the prejudice which might arise in the minds of the unbiased. And we did not petition for a habeas corpus until we had told the constable that on our lives we dare not go to Carthage for trial, and plead with him to go before any count magistrate he pleased in our vicinity, which occurrence is common in legal proceedings, and not a member of our society, so that our lives might be saved from the threats thus already issued against us." So, all right. Why don't we try and deal with that to the best of our ability right off the bat? Yes, Carthage was one of the two sister city hotbeds of anti-Mormonism. The anti-Mormon political party was literally formed by Thomas Coke Sharp and a few others, headquartered in Warsaw and Carthage. That was where a lot of this anti-Mormon sentiment came from. They were neighboring cities, Carthage and Warsaw, as well as Carthage and Nauvoo, right? There were only little tiny like houses and farms in between the two cities. They were the two large cities right just 20 miles apart. So a lot of the sentiment is accurate here, that the people of Carthage were threatening him with death. He expected that if he stepped foot in the city of Carthage, that he would be shot and killed. Therefore, he did not want to go before the circuit court in Carthage. But then to claim that it was with great reluctance that they instead went before the municipal court in Nauvoo is crazy to me. Because he knew that he wouldn't get a fair trial in Carthage, but it was impossible for Joseph Smith to get a fair trial in his own little fiefdom, right? Daniel H. Wells, who was the person who chaired the hearing, is a fascinating figure in early Mormonism because he wasn't actually a member at this time, but he was also a Danite, and he was also somebody who would go out to Utah and be a Mormon out there, right? Daniel Wells is a really fascinating figure in that he wasn't ever officially a member of the church in Joseph Smith's time in Nauvoo. And Joseph was able to use that leverage that he was not a member of our society, but he was a magistrate in our vicinity who would hear our hearing, who would chair our hearing. so that our lives might be saved from the threats already issued against us. But once again, this taps into a much deeper rooted issue than just people in Carthage wanted to murder Joseph Smith, because they didn't want to murder him in a vacuum. Right? The Carthaginians didn't hate Joseph Smith because he was the Mormon prophet. They hated him because Nauvoo was a tyrannical empire that was not beholden to any laws. And him burning the printing press of the Nauvoo Expositor was just the latest outrage in a string of outrages 6 years long that the people were no longer willing to tolerate. Therefore, many people were threatening him with death. Yes, that's what happens when you stomp on people's rights and when you are a terrible neighbor and you don't pay your bills and you manufacture and trade in counterfeit coins and this is probably not a very diplomatic way of saying this. When you steal their daughters, convert them to your church, and marry the teenagers to your cronies, right? People didn't like Nauvoo. It's not that it's because it was the Mormon settlement. It's because it was a criminal empire. The people wanting to kill Joseph Smith, who lived in Carthage, wanted to kill him for many reasons. Only a small part of that was because he was the prophet of Mormonism. Continuing on. In Joe's defense here. The press was declared a nuisance under the authority of the charter as written in the 7th section of addenda, the same as the Springfield Charter. So if the act of declaring a press a nuisance was unconstitutional, we cannot see how it is that the charter itself is not unconstitutional. And if we have erred in judgment, it is an official act and belongs to the Supreme Court to correct it and assess damages versus the city to restore property abated as a nuisance. If we have erred in this thing, we have done it in good company, for Blackstone on quote-unquote wrongs asserts the doctrine that scurrilous prints may be abated as nuisances. Right. What is the mechanism of abating a nuisance, and what is declared as a public nuisance? And also notably, Blackstone was a legal book about English law, not American law. Like, there's a really important point here. But the point really stands that Governor Ford made a really strong assertion, or not assertion, but assessment of the facts here. If you're going to abate a press as a nuisance, you can pass through your city or your city council that something can broadly be called a nuisance. And then if a paper happens to publish things that you consider libelous, that's something for the courts to handle. You can't just pass that ordinance and then immediately abate something by burning it. When something is a nuisance to you, when you consider something libelous, you sue the publishers of it. And then it's handled in the courts. You can't just marry the two branches of your government together, the judicial and the legislative, to pass any ordinance that is fitting for you in a very split-second decision. And how do you abate a nuisance? How do you abate a printing press? You do it by suing them, not by burning it to the ground, right? That is my defense to Joe's defense of Governor Ford's assessment of the facts, because that is what happened. So Joseph Smith, in some ways, he obfuscates what happened here. He paints with a very broad brush on what can be considered official acts, what can be declared as a nuisance according to the Nauvoo City Charter, which was a copy-paste of the Springfield City Charter, right? And we were able to declare the thing a nuisance, therefore we abated it. And if the people are not happy with that, they can take this to the Supreme Court. They can appeal the decision. But the problem is, this was not something that was handled in the Nauvoo Municipal Court. It was handled in the City Council. Therefore, there was no legal decision that declared it a nuisance. There was no court decision that declared the expositor a nuisance that could then be appealed to the circuit court, that could then be appealed to the Supreme Court. If there was a court judgment that could be appealed, this would be largely different, but that's not what happened here. He continues. As to martial law, we truly say that we were obliged to call out the forces to protect our lives, and the Constitution guarantees to every man that privilege, and our measures were active and efficient as the necessity of the case required. But the city is and has been continually under the special direction of the marshal all the time. No person to our knowledge has been arrested only for violation of the peace, and those some of our own citizens, all of whom we believe are now discharged. So there's a mix of lying in here. There is a mix of obscuring the truth by not telling the whole truth. And then there's some genuine stuff here, right? As to martial law, hey, I'm Lieutenant General of a state-sanctioned militia. I can declare martial law if I think that is necessary to protect our lives. That is a reasonable assertion, and he did it. And he believed that the lives of himself and many members of his city council were in danger. And those are, for better or worse, as much as we don't like to agree with it, those were elected officials. They were elected in fiefdom inside of an autocracy, right? But they were elected officials, and therefore they were government officials. And therefore, if government officials' lives are in danger, you got to do something, probably with military force. And declaring martial law was one way to ensure that everybody whose lives were threatened, including Joseph Smith himself, that their lives would be secure. Putting out a night guard, guarding the Nauvoo neighbor printing press, guarding various property, including apparently guarding William Law's property, who William Law himself apparently tried to burn, according to Joseph Smith's prior letter, which I find hard to believe. But then he goes into our measures were active and efficient as the case required. And then it's been under the special direction of the marshal all the time, as well as the Major General Jonathan Dunham, not just Marshal John P. Green, because John P. Green was an appointed official at the hand of the mayor who should handle the city police force, right? Jonathan Dunham was the Major General of the Nauvoo Legion. That's a step above the police force. But unfortunately, both of these guys answered to the same commanding officer, Joseph Smith. So whoever was handling the martial law and what was going on at the time, it's really hard to determine whether or not that was a legal action in the purview of the city officers, the mayor, and carried out by the marshal of the city, or whether that was a martial, not marshal, but martial declaration handled by the military of General Jonathan Dunham, because both of those guys had been, active in enforcing the martial law order. But there's an important point here, and that goes back to something that was published in the Warsaw Signal we read earlier. If this was a martial act, if Joseph Smith did this in the capacity of a militia officer, he could be held for a court-martial, and they could immediately determine that this was treasonous and execute him on the spot, as had happened with General Lucas back in Missouri when Alexander Doniphan refused to carry out that execution order. Then he says, no person to our knowledge has been arrested only for violation of the peace, and some of our own citizens. No person's been arrested. But the people who have been arrested, they did it because they were violating the peace. And, some of them are our own citizens, but no person has been arrested, except for some who are violated the peace. And some of them are our own citizens, but no person has been arrested. But all of whom I believe are now discharged. So don't worry about it, okay? Don't worry about the people that we arrested. Don't worry about the people we detained unlawfully under the declaration of martial law. Those people are all discharged, but we didn't do it in the first place, so don't worry about it. I can't believe that was a defense he raised. Anyway, he goes on. And if any property has been taken for public benefit without compensation or against the will of the owner, it has been done without our knowledge and consent, and when shown shall be corrected if the people will permit us to resume our usual labors. The property that was stolen from the printing office of the Nauvoo Expositor, if it was stolen, I don't know anything about it. No. I mean, I'm just mayor. I don't know what's going on in the city. I don't know what my officers are doing under the cover of nightfall when they burn printing presses and incite riots. I don't know what they're doing. No. If the people will just let us resume our usual labors, we'll figure out what really happened to that property. If we have committed a gross outrage upon the laws and liberties of the people, as your excellency represents, we are ready to correct that outrage when the testimony is forthcoming. All men are bound to act in their sphere of their own judgment, and it would be quite impossible for us to know what your excellency's judgment would have been in the case referred to, consequently acted on our own. And according to our best judgment, after having taken able counsel in the case, if we have erred, we again say we will make it all right if we can have the privilege. We made a mistake, but hey, we'll make a proper defense. And if we were in the wrong, then we'll make it right. We'll pay restitution to the people who are offended. So he's starting off with saying we didn't do anything wrong. And then if we did do anything wrong, it wasn't like really wrong. Blackstone's got our back, and my lawyer said that we were in good company and that we could do it. And if those lawyers are wrong, and if I was wrong, and if these are gross outrage upon the laws and liberties of the people, hey, just listen to our side of the story, and then we're going to make it right, right? Asking for forgiveness instead of permission. The Constitution also provides that the people shall be protected against all unreasonable search and seizure. True, the doctrine we most fully believe have acted upon it, but we do not believe it reasonable to search so far as it is necessary to protect life and property from destruction. So the people that we totally didn't arrest, we had to do searches and seizures selectively, but it was to protect life and property from destruction. So, but all those people are discharged, so please don't worry about them. We do not believe in the union of legislative and judicial power, and we have not so understood the action of the case in question. That was, one of the major issues that Governor Ford raised was you didn't pass a broad order through your city council and then have your municipal court determine that the expositor was a nuisance and then order it abated. You just did both the legislative and the judicial powers immediately in a night and then burn the printing press. That's not acceptable. But of course, Joseph Smith said, we don't believe in the union of legislative and judicial power. That's apparently a lie because his actions speak louder than his words. Whatever power we have exercised in the habeas corpus has been done in accordance with the letter of the Charter and Constitution as we confidently understood them, and that too with the ablest counsel. But if it be so that we have erred in this thing, let the Supreme Court correct the evil. Hey, if we messed up with the whole habeas corpus thing, I'm not going to pay attention to what you're saying, Governor Ford. Why don't we just take this to the Supreme Court? I'm going to go over your head to the federal government and see what the Supreme Court has to say about this to correct the evil. We have never gone contrary to constitutional law so far as we have been able to learn it. If lawyers have belied their profession to abuse us, the evil be on their heads. Hey, if I retained incompetent counsel and I made some tyrannical decisions, hey, it's their fault. It's totally not my fault. You don't get to do that. You're literally mayor and the commander-in-chief of the Nauvoo Legion, of your own militia. Like, you represent the two highest offices of government and military power in your city. You don't get to say, well, I had a bad lawyer. It's that bad lawyer's fault. You don't get to do that. You have intimated that no press has been abated as a nuisance in the United States. We refer your excellency to Humphrey versus Press in Ohio, who abated the press by his own arm for libel, and the courts decided on prosecution, no cause of action. Okay, so I looked everywhere for this Humphrey versus Press in Ohio. I looked everywhere to try and find the details of that case to know whether or not Joseph was accurately or falsely representing that case. But once again, that taps into Governor Ford's initial assessment that Joseph Smith married together the legislative and the judicial branches in the city, and that was abhorrent to the Constitution. And here Joseph is saying, hey, so we declared it a nuisance, just like Humphrey versus the press in Illinois did. So in one way that nullifies Joseph's argument that we're not putting together legislative and judicial branch. But at the same time, he's saying, well, our city council used the jurisprudence of Humphrey versus Press in Ohio to declare the press was a public nuisance. I don't know the details of that case. So once again, I don't know if that's an accurate assessment or if there's some contextualizing details that make Humphrey versus Press in Ohio a legitimate case. But then Joseph goes on to say, and we do know that it is common for police in Boston, New York, etc. to destroy scurrilous prints. And we think the loss of character by libel and the loss of life by mobocrat prints to be a greater loss than a little property. All of which, life alone excepted, we have sustained, brought upon us by the most unprincipled outlaws, gamblers, counterfeiters, and such characters as have been standing by me and probably are now standing around your excellency, namely those men who have brought these evils upon us. I'm not an expert on the history of printing presses in America. Was it common for police in Boston and New York to just destroy printing presses? Was that a common theme? Was that something that happened frequently in the 18th and 19th centuries? I don't think that's accurate. Because if that were the case, then, well, I don't know. There would have to be a lot of jurisprudence to overturn those things happening. And there would be multiple legal cases that Joe could cite instead of just Humphrey versus Press in Ohio, which I can't find, that he would be able to say, like, we did what these other people had done. Instead, he just says, well, they burn printing presses in Boston and New York all the time, so we did the same thing. And that it's better to lose a little property than it is life. And that's an interesting point, right? Because if the printing press is established, the printing press that is destroyed is established for revealing information that will preserve life, and destroying it does not allow those lives to be preserved, then you're losing more lives by destroying that printing press. Yeah. And also he says, hey, the people who you're surrounded by right now, those are the same people who I was surrounded by, those outlaws, gamblers, counterfeiters, and such characters. Those are the people who are now telling you lies that apparently, used to be standing by me. You know, those Higbees, those Fosters, those Laws, those Joseph Jacksons, He continues, we have no knowledge of men's being sworn to pass our city, and upon receipt of your last message, the Legion was disbanded and the city left to your excellency's disposal. That's not true. He never undeclared martial law. Martial law was still in effect at the time that he sent this. So no, the city was not at the governor's disposal. It was at Joseph Smith's disposal. And that's really kind of the crux of the issue here. How it could be possible for us now to be tried constitutionally by the same magistrate who first issued the writ at Carthage, we cannot see. Here it goes. I hope you're ready for this. He says, for the Constitution expressly says, no man shall twice be put in jeopardy of life and limb for the same offense. Bingo. That's something when we read through the hearing, that June 17th hearing, 3 episodes ago, that I said when Joseph Smith had the second hearing, he was doing it for a couple of reasons, one of which was double jeopardy. If he was tried in his municipal court on the charges of riot, then he could claim that if he was being dragged to Carthage to the circuit court, he had already been tried for this crime and discharged. Therefore, it's double jeopardy. And here in this letter to Governor Ford, Joseph Smith raised his defense. This is double jeopardy. You can't drag me to Carthage because we already had our municipal court hearing in Nauvoo that discharged us on the crimes of riot. So we're not going to comply. The Constitution expressly says no man shall twice be put in jeopardy of life and limb for the same offense. He continues, and all you refer to have since the issue of the habeas corpus been complied with for the same offense and tried before Daniel H. Wells, Justice of the Peace for Hancock County, and after a full investigation were discharged. So he makes the argument, hey, this is double jeopardy. We already had the hearing. We're not going to have it again, right? Then he goes on to say, but notwithstanding this, we would not hesitate to stand another trial according to your excellency's wish, were it not that we are confident our lives would be in danger. We dare not come. Writs we are issued against us in various parts of the country. For what? To drag us from place to place, from court to court, across creeks and prairies, till some bloodthirsty villain can find his opportunity to shoot us. We dare not come, though your excellency promises protection. Yet at the same time, you have expressed fears that you could not control the mob, in which case we are left to the mercy of the merciless. Sir, we dare not come, for our lives would be in danger, and we are guilty of no crime. First defense, this is double jeopardy. Second defense, we would do this, but our lives are in danger. Third defense, if we leave Nauvoo, some bloodthirsty villain is going to kill us, and the whole premise of all of these arrest warrants and everything is just so some bloodthirsty villain can find his opportunity to shoot us. We dare not come, and you even told us that you can't control the mob. It's a multifaceted defense, and each point in some ways nullifies the previous point, but there is some nugget of truth at each and every one of them. Joseph Smith did have his hearing, so there was a color of double jeopardy there. It's not true because the municipal court, the hearings there would reach whatever conclusion Joseph Smith wanted, so it wasn't a fair trial to claim that he had his first trial and that this was double jeopardy. But the various warrants being issued, saying that they're issued just to get us vulnerable so that some bloodthirsty villain can shoot us, that bakes into the premise that there's no merit to any of these accusations, to any of these arrest warrants. Therefore, we shouldn't have to comply with them. Anyway, he continues. You say, it will be against orders to be accompanied by others. Hey, Joe, don't bring your posse. You're going to die. If we come to trial, this we have been obliged to act upon in Missouri, and when our witnesses were sent for by the court, as your honor promises to do, they were thrust into prison, and we left without witnesses. That's a tough one. He says, Sir, you must not blame us, for a burnt child dreads the fire. And although your excellency might be well disposed in the matter, the appearance of the mob forbids our coming. We dare not do it. Back to the Missouri Mormon War, right? When Joseph Smith and his immediate officers, the 5 guys, were arrested along with Joseph Smith and taken to jail for their court of inquiry, one of the major issues was they called their witnesses. Alexander Donovan served as Joe's legal counsel, the Mormon leadership's counsel in that court of inquiry. They said, we need this person, this person, this person, this person. We need these 10 people to be our witnesses for what happened during this Missouri Mormon War. And then the officers went and arrested those people and brought them in to testify during the court of inquiry. Joe claims that they were unable to testify. That's not true. We read through an extensive amount of the court documents, and there were many people who were Joe's friends who were currently surrounding him in Nauvoo as his current officers and closest confidants, who did testify on Joe's behalf during that court of inquiry. That's just a tough one. That's a really, really tough one. But the thing was with the court of inquiry is they were all witnesses for the prosecution. They weren't able to call witnesses for the defense because it was just a court of inquiry. It was not a jury trial where they would hear the prosecution and then the defense witnesses and then the cross-examination. That's not what happened in the court of inquiry. The court of inquiry was just held to establish whether or not there was enough evidence to hold the Mormon leadership in state jails in order to go forward with an investigation and have a full jury trial. But because Joseph Smith escaped prison by bribing the prison guards with whiskey and $500, he never had the jury trial that the state attempted to collect evidence for. So that's a really complicated one there. So Joe says, we didn't get our witnesses in Missouri. You may say that you have that you'll bring in witnesses as they're needed, but we don't believe you. We are a burned child who dreads the fire. We were burned once by Missouri. We're not going to be burned by Illinois. And besides, the mob forbids our coming. We dare not do it. Even if you grant safe passages to the witnesses, you said it yourself. You can't control your own mob. They're going to die if they enter Carthage to testify as witnesses for Joseph Smith. And there is some merit to that claim. Yeah, we've seen that before. People who testify against a popular person. That Anita Hill in the Clarence Thomas hearings, right? Like, she was vilified, death threats. Even to this day, there are death threats against Anita Hill for testifying against Clarence Thomas, right? Witnesses are put in danger when they are testifying against or on behalf of a popular or a pariah figure, right? Anyway, final paragraph from Joseph Smith. We have been advised by legal and high-minded gentlemen from abroad who came on the boat this evening to lay our grievances before the federal government, as the appearance of things is not only treasonable against us, but against this state on the part of Missouri, unless the same has been requested of Governor Ford by the federal government. And we suppose your excellency is well aware by this time that the mass meetings of the county declared utter extermination of the Mormons, and that the Legion was not called out until complaints were made to the mayor, and the citizens were afraid of their lives and losing their confidence in the authorities of the city, and that nothing on the part of the city authorities had been wanting legally and judiciously to allay excitement and restore peace. We shall leave the city open and unprotected, and by everything that is sacred, we implore your excellency to cause our helpless women and children to be protected from mob violence, and let not the blood of innocents cry to the heavens against you. We again say, if anything wrong has been done on our part, and we know of nothing, we've done nothing wrong. He says that, and we know of nothing, in italics, emphasized. We will make all things right if the government will give us the opportunity. Disperse the mob and secure to us our constitutional privileges, that our lives may not be endangered when on trial. I remain most respectfully your excellency's humble servant, signed Joseph Smith, Mayor. That final point. Hey, Governor Ford, it's getting a little hot around here. We're going to go to the federal government. Yeah, I know you're a government. I know you're a commander-in-chief of state militias. And I know that you got a lot of clout around these parts, being the governor of our state and all. We're going to go to the federal government. We're going to go to the Supreme Court, and we're going to send letters to President John Tyler. We think we're probably getting in over our heads here. So we're going to disband our militia. We promise we'll disband our martial law in Nauvoo. Just make sure that you secure us. Make sure that the blood of our innocent women and children don't cry out to the heavens against you. It's kind of a backhanded threat, isn't it? Well, I'm the prophet. I speak for God. Hey, don't get sent to hell by not doing your part to protect us. Besides, we didn't do anything wrong. We know of nothing wrong. We again say, if anything wrong has been done on our part, and we know of nothing, we will make all things right if the government will give us the opportunity. And with that letter, Joe drew a battle line with Governor Thomas Ford, and there was no going back. Deny, obfuscate, gaslight, outright lie, and then cap it all off with saying, we've done nothing wrong, and our lives are also in danger. So you better do your job, Governor. Okay. So, whether or not Joe believed that he did wrong, I think that's a really complicated issue, right? Whether or not he knew that he was in trouble is a lot simpler to me. He was in trouble, and he knew he was in trouble. And he knew that this time was different from every other time that he had been in trouble. Joe staked his position in the conflict, and he told the governor that the governor was wrong. The mobocrats were wrong. Everybody on the planet was wrong, and that he had done nothing wrong. And every interaction between Joe and Governor Ford from this point forward was hostile. And Ford would be successfully branded as an enemy to the Mormons after this letter exchange. To capture that mentality, permit me a brief final reading for today from the history of the church. I know it's been a long episode, going back to the old school naked Mormonism roots, but just bear with me. Final reading, quote, It appears that the governor, on arriving at Carthage, ordered the entire mob into service, adopted the lies and misrepresentations calculated against us by our enemies as the truth, turned Supreme Court, and decided on the legality of our municipal ordinances and proceedings, which is the business of the judiciary alone. He charges us in his letter, based upon the most cursed falsehoods, with violations of law and order, which have never been thought of by us. He treated our delegates very rudely. My communications that were read to him were read in the presence of a large number of our worst enemies, who interrupted the reader at almost every line with, "That's a damned lie," and "That's a goddamned lie." He never accorded to them the privilege of saying one word to him, only in the midst of such interruptions as, "You lie like hell," from a crowd of persons present. These facts show conclusively that he is under the influence of a mob spirit, the adversary, and is designedly intending to place us in the hands of murderous assassins, and is conniving at our destruction, or else that he is so ignorant and stupid that he does not understand the corrupt and diabolical spirits that are around him. End quote. The tribes had balkanized. The battle lines were drawn. 5 days, everybody. 5 days away. Our historical timeline is less than a week away from Joseph and Hyrum Smith being struck dead as a result of this growing tension and violence. Just like last week, today's show covered only a day and a half. And trust me, I'm leaving out a lot. And it's a testament to how complicated these events really were and how hard it is to get to the bedrock of what was actually going on. Look, we know what happens. We have hindsight and a century and a half of historians working through documents and artifacts to construct the models by which we can understand and contextualize this history. But for the people living through it, every morning they woke up from stress-filled sleep to a nightmare of uncertainty and conflict. Every decision made had consequences which would shape the future of world history. And for the people living through this conflict, the consequences extended beyond the mortal realm. These were decisions in life which echoed through eternity. If I can appropriate the words of a New Zealander playing an ancient Roman gladiator with a British accent, apparently. Whatever. Terrible movie. This is what happens, though. When you bend a system to the breaking point and you push it even more, the break is going to happen. And then when Daddy eventually comes home, you have to explain the broken TV, right? Well, Daddy was in town. Governor Ford was here to deal with the problems and get to the root of the issues. But Joe viewed himself above the law because he was living a higher law, one that he had made up in his sociopathic brain. Right? But you simply can't do that forever. You can't abide by laws that you like and ignore laws you don't. That's not how society works unless you're president. At least not a functional society, right? In a functional society, the president is held to the same laws as the pastors, as the teachers, as the doctors, as the janitors. We all agree to abide by those laws because those laws make society better and safer. When a Joseph Smith comes along and places himself in polar defiance, opposing that system of laws, either he breaks or the system breaks. In our society, when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, it always results in human suffering. That's going to do it for our episode today. We have a new patron to thank over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. This is a new pledge from an anonymous who desires to be called by Formo, who says they have family up and down the Wasatch Front that are all, in caps, Mormons. Thanks, Bryce. So to Formo, thank you so much for pledging to support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. What do you get if you support the show? A whole bunch of extra content, as well as extended editions of the last 100 episodes, actually, at this point. Also, an extra episode every week. And what was that this week? Well, it was a live Q&A that we did. It was a live stream onto YouTube. You can watch the thing on the Naked Mormonism YouTube channel if you would like, or if you are a patron supporter, you get the high quality, super crisp, clean audio in your patron exclusive feed. Hopefully that was enjoyable. And I'd like to do more of these Q&As. They tend to generate a bit of a response, and people seem to enjoy it, and people have shared it around and stuff. So that, it seems to be getting a good response. We'll be doing more of these Q&As, maybe monthly. Anyway, so also wanted to let y'all know, episode 46 of the Glassbox podcast that just aired this week, it was one of those that stood out as a bit of an exceptional episode because of the interview that we did on that episode. Braden was able to get in touch with a couple of current missionaries who no longer believe in the church and who are unable to go home because of the disapproval of their parents, as well as the quarantine. It was a fascinating interview. So that's episode 46 of the Glassbox podcast. It's titled Broken Missionaries. Plus, it's part 4 of the Case for the Book of Mormon. That's a book that I'm reading, and it's horrible. But hey, it's written by a guy who's currently gunning for apostle, Tad R. Callister, and it is what the title says, The Case for the Book of Mormon. We've read through almost the whole thing. We've done 4 out of 5 parts of The Case for the Book of Mormon in the backlog of Glassbox podcast. If that's something that interests you and you want to get, caught up on current events in the church, and, we have deep dives into current events and contextualizing history of current events of Mormonism, in and out of Mormonism. We also do like 4-hour episodes on General Conference and stuff. If that's something that interests you, hey, Glassbox podcast. It's a great show, but that's my opinion because I make it. I have a lot of fun making the show, and we do put a lot of time and effort into it. So if that's something that interests you, current events in the church, mostly in the church, sometimes outside of the church, but we leave you with the feeling that the world isn't actually on fire at the end of every episode, with a little bit of happy news as well. So, hey, if you need some happy news in your life, if you want to laugh at a terrible Book of Mormon apologetics book and listen to a fascinating interview with a couple of current missionaries who are unable to leave their missions, episode 46, Glassbox podcast, that is for you. Otherwise, hey, share the show, rate it on whatever podcasting app you use. I actually use Podcast Addict to listen to all of my podcasts, and it just now I know some podcast apps do this, but it just now implemented a feature where you can do one-click reviews for podcasts. I have now done that to all of my regular podcasts that I listen to because it's so easy. Now it's so easy to rate and review podcasts, and that helps a ton with visibility. But if you're unable to rate the show, if you're unable to share it for any reason, hey, you still stuck around. You still listened. You gave me the most valuable thing that is in your possession, and that is your time. And that really means a lot to me. So for that, I want to thank you so much for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.